Hey guys, with this slideshow we'll be moving into ancient Greece, which is going to compose a good chunk of the next unit. They're a very important civilization for determining the future course of the Western world, so we need to spend some time here to understand the roots of a lot of what happens in Europe later on. Let's start, like we always do, with geography. The first and most important thing that you can know about Greek geography is that it is a land of mountains and islands, and this brings with it a number of important implications. First, it leads to the development of a number of independent city-states. Because Greece is divided up into so many tiny little valleys and islands, it's very hard to unite a large patch of territory under a single ruler. And so what you see is the growth of hundreds, if not thousands, of small, independent city-states. And so rather than any kind of Greek empire, what we see for the majority of Greece's history is a Greek culture that's united in terms of like religion and stuff like that, but that is divided politically between hundreds of independent city-states. Another factor that is caused by the mountains and islands of Greece is that large-scale agriculture is quite difficult. There are no river valleys in Greece like in the other places that we've seen, and there are only a few valleys that really suit themselves for growing a lot of grain. And this, combined with all of the excellent harbors that the Greek landscape provides, encourages the Greeks to become a trading people. The Greeks produce, instead of grain, a lot of luxury items like wine, olive oil, and marble, and they trade this for staple products with other cultures, namely importing wheat and barley and other food crops. One important effect of all of this trading is that the Greeks come into contact quite early with the older civilization's ideas. For example, they adopt the Phoenician alphabet, and they also encounter and begin to use and improve upon Egyptian and Mesopotamian math and science. So the culture that we normally think of as Greek actually replaced cultures that had already been existing in Greece before then. These include the civilizations of Mycenae and Crete. And these earlier civilizations go into a decline and are eventually replaced by the warlike culture known as the Dorians, who invade Greece as part of a larger migration of peoples around 1100 BC. They're actually related linguistically and culturally to the Aryans, which invaded the Indus River Valley much earlier. So for about 300 years, there appears to be somewhat of a dark age in Greece with very little cultural activity going on and very little writing. But around 800 BC, new cities and a new written culture emerge. Most of what we know about this early period we have to infer from the writings of the famous poet Homer. And Homer gives us, in his two great works, the Iliad and the Odyssey, some insight into the culture and the values of early Dorian civilization. We see a world dominated by whimsical gods, great warriors, and heroes. In the Iliad, we see a depiction of war, in fact, the siege of a city, in his depiction of the Trojan War. And in the Odyssey, we follow a single protagonist, Odysseus, as he seeks to return to Greece after the Trojan War is over. In both cases, we get a glimpse into what the Greek ideal of a man was, and we can see how Greeks were supposed to behave. It's an interesting way to get a perspective on what the Greeks actually cared about. So at the heart of the civilization that the Dorians develop, aka ancient Greece, is the polis. And the polis is really just a fancy word for a city-state. And so the polis is composed of a small walled city that would house between a few hundred to a few thousand citizens. Sometimes this could be a little bit more. In very few cases, a lot more, like ancient Athens, but generally these were fairly small communities. They were also very tight-knit because they had to work together for self-defense in agriculture and in all of their religious and cultural practices. So people got to know each other quite well in these smaller communities. They were also fiercely independent and would fight to remain independent, sometimes to the bitter end. The city was centered around an area called the Acropolis, which really just means the high city. And it was there that they would build their temples to the gods in order to try and win the favor of certain selected deities. They would also control a certain amount of countryside outside of the city where they would grow their crops, which they would then trade to other city-states or to further distant civilizations. The fact that there were so many different city-states led to an interesting degree of political diversity within the Greek civilization. So different city-states had different forms of government. Some city-states functioned as a monarchy, where there was a single ruler, perhaps a king, who would pass his rule on to his children. But also we saw the rise of other interesting political forms. For example, many city-states were oligarchies, where a few, usually very wealthy citizens made decisions as a group, kind of as a high council. And they would decide what would happen for the city-state, but using their wealth, they would also provide for the poorer citizens who did not have any political power. And most interestingly, we see for the first time in human history, since civilization began, democratic rule. That is, a certain number of city-states adopted a system known as democracy. And this is where a large number of the citizens within the city-state got the chance to make their voice heard. There would be votes, there would be councils composed of all free men. And this is a really interesting development because it's the first time we see it, and one of the rare times in history that we see democracy before the modern period. Another characteristic of Greek civilization was that they were in constant battle with one another. Each city-state would basically fight a war with one or many other city-states every year. And so they always had to be ready to defend themselves and to defend their political freedom. This meant that every adult male was expected to serve in the military. Their rights as citizens were dependent upon their ability to serve as a soldier. And the rise of Greek democracy, which we'll talk about more later, was linked to the fact that since every male had to fight in the army, they believed that they also deserved the right to decide who the city would go to war with, whether the city would go to war. If you're willing to risk your life for the city, you should also be given political rights within that city. That's the basic idea. And how Greek warfare worked is they would fight in this formation known as a phalanx. And it was a massive formation of armored spearmen. They'd have huge bronze shields, long spears, and then bronze helmets and chest plates. And how it would work is... Thank you, Zeus. How it would work is they would line up and push against the other phalanx, and whichever phalanx broke first would lose. So what you really needed was training and cooperation to win, because everybody in the phalanx had to work together and push as a single unit if they were going to have success in battle. And this led to tight cooperation and camaraderie between all of the male citizens within a city-state. One thing that united the Greek city-states was that they all worshipped the same group of gods. And certain cities favored certain gods, but they all basically accepted the same pantheon of gods, at least for a long time. And one thing that's interesting about these gods is that they are extremely anthropomorphic. That is, they're very much like human beings. All of these gods display human qualities and flaws. For example, you'll see a typical god displaying such emotions as jealousy, anger, and lust. These gods are sometimes seen as the embodiment of natural forces, and other times they're viewed as the embodiment of human experiences. So, for example, some of the natural gods are Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades, who represent the sky, the sea, and the underworld, respectively. But some of the more human-type gods, such as Ares, Aphrodite, and Apollo, represent human experiences of war, love, music, and reason. And so I find this interesting, that they embody both natural and human elements of existence. One thing that most Greeks were concerned about when they practiced religion was winning the favor of the gods. So the gods, being very much like humans, could be swayed one way or the other. They could be convinced to help you if you did good things for them, but could also be swayed to harm you if you didn't do the right thing. So one thing that the Greeks would do is they would build temples to the gods. And as you remember, the Acropolis, the center of the city, was devoted to temples to the gods of that city. So for example, in Athens, they built a huge temple to Athena, the goddess of wisdom, in hopes of winning her favor. They would also hold festivals and sacrifices in honor of the gods. Sometimes the city would pay for these big processions where they would sacrifice a bunch of cows, and then everybody would basically have a big party in honor of a certain god. And they believed that this festival would win them the blessing of the god and would help them in future wars or future harvests or whatever. Perhaps the most interesting of all of the different Greek festivals was the Olympics. And all the Greeks from all over the place would send their best athletes to Olympus, or just around the giant mountain Olympus where they believed the gods lived. And there they would compete in different athletic events in honor of Zeus. So they'd run, they'd sprint, they'd wrestle, they'd throw things, all in honor of a god. And I guess they believed that the god took pleasure in witnessing these great human feats. You could also, it was believed, speak with the gods and receive messages from them. And most famously, there was a place in Delphi where you could go speak with the oracle. And the oracle was a woman who devoted her life to the god Apollo, who was the god of reason. And if you made an offering to the temple, in return, the oracle would give you a message from the god about your life. And many Greeks would travel far and wide to visit this oracle and to receive a message from the god. So that's a tiny taste of what Greek religion was like. The most important thing to remember is that it united all Greeks. So even though the Greeks were divided politically, they were united around this common set of religious beliefs. So here are some key terms. We'll talk more about this stuff later. We'll definitely talk more about Greek religion and Homer tomorrow in class, so be ready for that.